Hello, welcome to everyone. So this series of webinars are part of the third stage of our project, Roots of Resilience. It's a People's Palace Projects project, which has been supported by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which funds arts and humanities research from the UK, and also by the Ministry of Digital Culture, Media and Sport. And in this third stage, we've also got support from the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, which is looking at the case of people who have been impacted by huge works. And this started as a research in the effect of culture within the Brazilian quadrilateral in Minas Gerais. We worked with lots of cultural organizations in this region to understand the positive impacts of culture within the territory and also within the lives of those people who take advantage of these practices. So we began this research to try and understand the value of culture, its impacts as well, and to try and measure those impacts and offer indicators so that we can understand better and be able to make these measures more accessible for the stakeholders. As a result of this research, we understood that promoting our research methodology was important so that it could be used in other contexts, as well as the importance of promoting interventions. So in our second stage, we had a series of webinars last year, and we had an educational project where we use art and culture to be able to promote debates about environmental issues related to mining, which is a strong industry in this region. Because as well as being a quadrilateral or quadrangle, as we call it, that's related to iron, there's also a lot of issues related to water within this region. So in this third stage, we're continuing with our artistical and cultural interventions and educational projects. And we've also invited other projects that are being funded by this same department in the UK, and financed by the AHRC, so that they can also share the methodologies that they use so that we can understand the relationship between the climate crisis and cultural heritage, which is something that unites this whole cohort of different research projects which are being financed by the British government. So my colleague Fabiana Comparato will introduce us to our first guest, and we will then start her presentation. The presentation that she will show us is to do with the project Critical, and it's important that we look at this link between the climate crisis and the risks that it is posing for cultural heritage, not just in Brazil, but all over the world. And we'd like to then invite you to think along with us about how art and culture and cultural heritage could serve as a mechanism to combat this climate crisis. So as well as thinking of the risks that we're exposed to, we're also thinking about how they can be part of the solution, how cultural heritage can be part of the solution. We'll then have a question and answer session. People can write questions in the chat. We will then convey those to our speakers. I'd also like to remind you that we are live. but the Portuguese and English versions of this webinar will be recorded and saved on PPP's YouTube channel. And if anybody is interested in our methodology, our research methodology for roots of resilience, or if anybody has any questions about what we are going to present today, you'll be able to send us your questions, and we're always open to having more webinars and more workshops so that we can continue disseminating these methodologies for measuring the impact on art and culture of the climate crisis, and so that you can use them in the future as control tools in terms of this issue of climate crisis. Now, let's
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Natalia, for this presentation. It's great to be here, to be opening this webinar series with Dr. Cha. I'll be introducing her, but just as a reminder as well, this webinar will be recorded and be available on People's Palace Project's YouTube, both in Portuguese and English. And yeah, let's start. So Dr. Cha is a postdoctoral research associate in climate change adaptation at the University of Edinburgh. She's an expert in climate change adaptation policy, climate risk, and collaborative vulnerability modeling. Her research focuses on interfacing between research, policy, and practice, embedded interdisciplinary approaches, working with international, national, and local institutions, and communicating with broader range of different stakeholders. In addition, she has research experience through working at Edinburgh Climate Change Institute and the Korean Adaptation Center for Climate Change. So she will be presenting today her methodology for critical, which is cultural heritage risk and impact tools for integrated and collaborative learning. We're not sure, but Rowan Jackson might also be joining us. Dr. Rowan also worked with critical in phase 1. Dr. Cha, on to you. Thank you very much for your presence today. It's a great pleasure to have you here, opening our webinar series.
Thank you so much for introducing me, Fabiana and Natalia. It is a great honor to be here today sharing our critical project methodology. So if you guys don't mind to share my slide, that would be amazing. So today I'm gonna introduce our main methodology, and this was funded by same funders to project People's Palace Project. And this is collaboration work across University Gadjah Mada in Indonesia and University of Pretoria in South Africa, and our independent researcher Dolma for case study work in Sri Lanka. So if we get next slide, please. So we got the first phase of critical project funding from 2020 to 2022. We mainly explored the heritage impact from disasters and climate change in our 3 case study area. And phase 2, we just got following funding for the South Africa case study and the Indonesia and Sri Lanka study. We got the fund from the university for research impact delivery focused work. Next, please. So the critical project, we aim to place lived heritage at the center of the risk assessment process. We built up oral histories and stories that reflect the life, ways, and experience of individuals and groups in each study case. So we collected diverse voices from each communities and try to understand the individual and collective values that could understood an assessment of the interplay between what is value of the community and therefore what is at risk could be developed. In return, this information could lead to local level adaptation planning and ongoing assessment of changing value and risk for each region. So we've got these the three case study area. The communities in Irlandsglof has a unique history with the colonial era, and then by the process of the reclaiming land, they've got a big scar that fragmented communities, conflicts, and increasing poverty, and also with the climate change they are facing at the moment. And then second case study area is in rural side across Sri Lanka. Also, they've got the same historical scar through the colonial era. Their indigenous knowledge has been abandoned, and their knowledge, traditional knowledge, has been replaced with the contemporary technology without considering their cultural heritage value in those areas. And our last case study area is Indonesia, the Yogyakarta in Java. They've got a big historical, cultural venue across the city, alongside the Cold River, from the mountain Matu to the ocean, the ocean area, and then this development in the town to attract tourists damages to their local communities neighbor to the Cold River, and those changed landscape in the city and the value of the community, what they are living with their natural environment. And then that was the first phase one that we explored those gathering stories and the climate risk profile. And then phase two, I will talk a bit more detail later around. So next, please. Next slide, please. So the basic approach is we are focusing on heritage as an essential component of the meaning and capacity within those communities in our case study area. And we wanted to understand the impact, climate change impact, and how this will present challenges and opportunity for heritage in action. So we are seeing heritage not only tangible heritage, but including intangible heritage, as well as it's not the object to the preserving the heritage, but rather we want to focus on the process of change that is the changing of their value and the heritage itself, including intangible heritage. Next, please. So for the phase one, the applied method is creating or gathering narratives. So the climate risk narrative development was the main focus. So we started with the summary of the local regional climate profile for each case study, and then using the historical climate data and literature review to have that local climate profiles. And next stage was we reconceptualized the pressure and release model, which developed by Windsor, and incorporate heritage as the focal point of the value and the risk through a series of workshops. And then finally, we got this story, we got this narrative into the climate change production model provided by IPCC. And then we got the three scenario. What if that climate had changed with a certain degree? And then the qualitative scenario we got is more participatory exercise sessions that make the community, local community, to think about when this climate change happen, what this would affect to our community in terms of their value of heritage and how this will going to change of their physical, tangible and intangible heritage. Next slide, please. So for the step one, in order to identify the contextual information for the risk assessment that I briefly talked to before, that's reconceptualizing the pressure and release model. And that's got the stage of finding root causes and the exposure to the risk and then vulnerability. And then they see the impact of climate change or the natural disasters. But that's modified it into the framework. So this work is led by Dr. Rowan, my colleague. He was working on critical phase 1 with the Kate Crowley, the project investor. And I'm not sure whether Rowan is here, but if he is here, he will be able to answer your question later. If not, I will try my best to answer your questions later. So this framework, we use this framework running at the series of workshops to collect stories and then try to identify what is the what was their key drivers of changes socially, economically, or politically, and then try to find their core asset, what is value to them as the heritage has been used as a tool. So around the heritage, the important heritage, including knowledge, belief, practice, or the landscape, and then what is value to their communities. Then we moved on to try to find out adaptive capacity, asking questions about what are the strengths and weakness in those communities, whether they've got social economic capacity or the governance wise, is the perception is more adaptable. So we try to find out adaptive capacity around their communities. And also we address the hazard awareness, whether there's a historical hazard they are aware of, experience it, and then they are prepared to respond for the future hazard as well. And then we got this story. Next slide, please. And incorporate with the 3 scenarios provided by climate projection provided by IPCC. So we got the scenario of 1 for 1.5 degree increase and 2 degree increase, 4 degree increase, and what this will be affected to the identified the risk framework that we went through. It was qualitative risk narratives that try to fit into those model climate projection model. And then we synthesize the core asset and vulnerability and adaptive capacity and hazard awareness information. Next slide, please. And then final our storyline built up like this table is the summary version, but the scenario provided by with the storylines. So if certain weather extreme happens to our case study area, what does it mean to environmentally and socially impacted to their communities? And then we identified for each cases the vulnerability, whether there is a loss and damage directly, indirectly to those local communities. And then try to find, is there any nature-based solution you can find from your traditional knowledge that you already have, or anything that you need from the external support from. Next slide, please. Can I just quickly check whether Ron is here? If not, I'm gonna keep going.
I think he hasn't joined, Dr. Cha. We're
Okay.
waiting still here. Okay.
It's absolutely fine. So I'm going to move on to our next phase. So it was briefly introduced in the beginning about our phase 2 applied, phase 2, critical phase 2 project. Can you go back to previous slide, please? So the phase 2, we used the participatory action research to map out indigenous knowledge system around our HIS3 case study and try to develop community toolkit to deliver our research outcome and share more knowledge and then revitalize the indigenous knowledge. So the first mapping tool we used for Sri Lanka case study. We explored the traditional usage of the meat tree, which is the indigenous tree in most of Sri Lanka area, but through the colonial era, they've been cut down those trees and lost their heritage of using meat tree. And then the second one was around the food heritage in Elandskloof, how the community knowledge has not been inherited to their next generation through colonial era, but we try to address that food heritage and bring communities together around that food heritage in order to prepare climate change. And the second tool we used for the participatory research action, that was for South Africa. We delivered Heritage Garden and used the Heritage Champions workbook and children's book and comic book, also interactive mapping tools to bring communities together, practice and make sure they are aware of these changes and coming impacts from climate change as well. So we also delivered a series of workshops to advertise or sharing our research outcome around the indigenous knowledge. Next, please. So the first two cases I'd like to introduce you is the Sri Lanka and Indonesia case. So we tried to develop that local community toolkit using those indigenous knowledge exchange workshops. And we tried to bring this all together and connect it to their policy stream to reflect our research outcome and finally bring those adaptation into the region. And this was a quite brief one, about 6-month project for this 2 case study, and it's done last month. Next slide, please. And our team from University Gada Mada and the independent researcher for Sri Lanka, they're all amazing collaborators. We were quite lucky to have our collaborator to deliver our research together. Next slide, please. And the detail of the Indonesia case study, they had a partnership with the local NGO called Pemerti. So they delivered this method, participatory method together. So they focused on gathering more story around the Cold River community, what is value to them. So they started with the in-depth interview around women's group and youth and visitors. And then they move on to the focus group discussion with the who lives around the Cold River to identify what is the knowledge of the local community. And the second discussion group, we had the interactive learning by using and developing together about interaction community toolkit map. And final workshop, they launched with their NGOs to share their findings and exercise with that community toolkit that developed, like comic book and the interactive mapping tool. Next slide, please. So that was the kind of final workshop. They launched that their community toolkit they developed through this research. Next slide, please. So the first one was the comic book they designed and aimed to demonstrate what changes happen, as well as the environmental knowledge around the river, what kind of ecological diversity was there, and nowadays why they can't see that as things anymore. And then the name of that comic book was the Sandy Color Code. So that's quite interesting meaning behind they put it as a title, because it's got like a couple of different interpretation, and the meaning that includes more hope for the future, if I can summarize that way. And then this comic book used in that workshop and then distribute to young youth people. Can you, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so they distributed it like children, and then they start using it as a coloring book. So while they're coloring these books, they were aware of the fauna and flora in the Cold River, and then aware why this is not existing anymore, and thinking about like they need to live with the river, protecting, more caring about the river. Next slide, please. And then their interactive map of Calico that was originally benchmarked from Thai NGO. They used to have a disaster mapping tool. So they modified it into the Calico context and then see whether it's been changed. So for example, the story got gathered from this, using this map, was the older generation, they remembers old days, what was their activities around the Calico River, like for example, fishing, and like water was fresh. But these days you can't think about that thing because it's got polluted by the process of developing those areas. So for example, there was a big project around the river. They put it the river bank because of the flood risk problem, but they were not thinking or involved with the communities, what they were thinking, what they value for living in those areas. And then since the riverbank was built, there were more contemporary, temporary residential area boomed up and became more slum area, as well as the hotels new hotels building brought a side effect of the behind of that hotel, that site became more slum area, and it may attract it to visitors for romanticize the city. However, it didn't bring the same effect, positive effect to the local communities. Next slide, please. So that was the picture that our collaborator in Indonesia, they use that mapping tool, communicate with the local neighborhood to think about past, current, future of their river and living with the river as well. So it was amazing tool that we got to either gathering the story from local communities and their knowledge and try to sum up with what is the core heritage to them and the value of it. Also, it brought the community together to communicate themselves, have a ownership of their community, which direction they want to go from now. Next slide, please. And the next case study is Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka has a case study for rural area. And then this was the one village around that big village tank. That village tank used to be a cascading water tank system. This was the traditional water irrigation and freshwater system in Sri Lanka, and that's not been used after the colonial era because they replaced with the dam and all these things. So from the first phase of the critical project, we gathered a story around that one, and then second phase, we used the meat tree for gathering the indigenous knowledge around it. Next slide, please. So apparently the meat tree is the cold like butter tree. The scientific name is there, and habitat is around the Sri Lanka, India, Nepal, and Burma. And then it has a reputation for drought resilient because it can survive 6 to 8 months of drought season. And we gathered a narrative around that tree usage from literature review and interviewed 25 village people aged 50 to 93 group in the village called Galtvawa. Next slide, please. And what we found, there is no waste at all using meat tree from leaves, barks, and the meat tree seeds, meat seeds, and even the fruit and flowers are attracting bats, and then bats droppings are quite useful and crucial fertilizer for the paddy field for their agricultural activities. Next slide, please. And those collected knowledge has been published as a children's book. So our independent researcher Dolma, she published this book and distributed around the village in Sri Lanka. Next slide, please. And then we applied a participatory training workshop tool. So we invited a person who's got knowledge about the meat tree, meat seed oil extraction. The traditional knowledge these days has been almost disappeared. So she ran a training workshop, invited 10 village women aged 20 to 75. and we got lots of help from the village people, including cultural officer and agricultural officer, teachers, and like village local administrators. Next slide, please. So the meat tree, the oil extraction workshop process were followed by like meat tree threshing the meat seed. And then they used all these tools and device naturally resourced, and it's not causing any pollution from it. And then all this process, you got extracting that oil. Next slide, please. And then after you extracted that oil, there is oil cake left. That's not also wasted. The indigenous people, they used to use this oil cake to medicine to their limbs and veins. And then they also demonstrated at the workshop and disseminated their uses of all this product. And the meat tree oil cake can be also used for a pest control as a mosquito repellent. Also, that cake can be used as a fertilizer for the paddy field. So there is no wasting all process of this meat tree oil extraction from their traditional knowledge. Next slide, please. Through this workshop, the children's book has been launched, and then sharing the meat tree to the participant. They can plant at their back garden and share the oil extracting goods to practice themselves at home as well. And then this movement got extended to wider community in Sri Lanka. Next slide, please. So after that workshop, follow-up activities had happened. So about like 86 preschool teachers and 4 early childhood education officers. They've got this motivational speech at their area, and then about 450 copies of that children's book has been distributed to school, and then the schools have facilitated the exercise of planting meat trees and then sharing these books and try to have reflexive idea by learning this knowledge around uses of meat tree. Also, there is ongoing active discussion in the village amongst the village elders. They wanted to replicate that workshop, try to revitalize their traditional knowledge and keep their heritage. Next slide, please. And the next case study is critical food. Critical food has the follow-on funding, and we try to extend and translate and apply the critical research finding from phase 1 in South Africa case. So we've got 3 different scale approaches. The local community level, the Inland Glove is focused on heritage crops and their resilience. Communities communicate climate change information, including adaptation planning via the toolkit. The toolkit is we applied a delivering heritage garden in the communities. And the regional level, we try to connect the local level policy brief and try to engage with the multi-stakeholder at the series of workshop. At the global level, we try to connect South Africa team to Caribbean team. So Caribbean team also has the indigenous food project. Next slide, please. So our main team in South Africa from University of Victoria. Next slide, please. And the phase 2 aims and objectives for that critical food is trying to support and share the growth of indigenous knowledge and cultural memory of the place. And then second aim is to share and translate critical bioclimatic information, what is the resilient crops to grow in the Elandskloof land, and integrate into local adaptation planning and agricultural practice. The last aim of this stage is to share the research finding on resilient crop type and food heritage practice. Next slide, please. So we got this participatory action research is saying, and critical phase 1, we address what is value to them, what is value to the Elandskloof local communities. And then phase 2 is learning by doing. So we delivered the food heritage garden, which is led by community leaders and climate youth champions, and triggered gathering communities working together on that garden. So we spotted a community garden through that land claim, but that land has been not used for years. So we got the permission from the community leaders whether we can use this as a community garden, and it was mortal like barrel land, and we have that climate youth champions about 20 age around 20s, and they were started with the 7, now it's a 5. They are working on the community garden. We just found today they are growing plants already, and it's got like not yet harvested, but they are expecting to harvest in coming month. So it's going really well at the moment, and we try these amazing outcomes to share with the policymakers or the local planning people to bring more support for them. So the next stage would be our fieldwork, going there to try to connect them and introduce to the wider community, and try to have the community's voice can be heard as well. So the next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I want to introduce more toolkits for delivering this work. So the method we use is workbook. So the 7 climate champions are currently recording their observation and experience working on the garden. So they've been clearing the land and then planting and growing, and will harvest and share some food. So they were going to record this work, as well as monitoring soil conditions and local climate for growing, storing their food. Also, they were going to talk to elderly people across communities in Elandskloof to gather indigenous knowledge, how they've been doing growing food and making food, sharing food in old days before the enforced movement, and when they came back, what does it change? So they can reflect their learning or observation comparing to the story they gather from the elder people. So this also hopefully make them to think ahead for themselves, their community, which direction they need to go for building more resilient communities, considering climate change as well. So this is the form, the diary form that we were going to use it, but we are not sure whether they are recording it, but we will possibly find out in coming in a couple of months. Next slide, please. So the international level of the connection for the delivering the impact of our research is bridging between South Africa and the Caribbean team. So we've got, next slide, please. We got the Caribbean team doing teaching climate justice and resilience through ancestral plant heritage in Jamaica. So this is also big collaboration work, including University of Edinburgh and the University of the West Indies. And there is a hummingbird community. They are the research partner, and Caribbean Youth Environment Network as well. Next slide, please. And then how we will gonna bring sharing these experiences and co-learning by connecting this amazing team together. So we're planning them to share their experiences working on climate food justice in Jamaica, and the Elands Grove Food Heritage Champion, the Climate Youth Champion working on Elands Grove's Food Heritage Garden. So we are planning to have a virtual network meeting so they can share their idea. Also thinking about exchanging postcards, because Elands Grove has a very vulnerable environment. So they don't have internet, so it's quite hard them to have exchange like videos or having internet, the virtual meeting regularly. So the postcard idea might be really good, but we will find out. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for listening. This is our key outcomes of critical phase 1. So we can hopefully share all this link and details. We've got a story maps gathered from each case study by using ArcGIS mapping tool. And we've got policy brief, as well as e-learning online course materials. This is all open access materials you can use or check when you have time. Thank you. Get back to you, Fabiana.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cha, for this great presentation and for sharing all this open resource material. I'm just reminding everyone that if you're interested, you can contact us if you missed the link, and we can share the link of the material that Dr. Cha just said is available online. We do have a question that I'd like to make, which is about challenges. So basically, what challenges did you encounter and what did you learn in adapting your methodologies to different communities and cultures? Because we could see that you had to sort of get information first from the local communities and then adapt the methodology so that it would be useful and make sense in that community. So if you could talk about the challenges and what did you learn in this process, that would be amazing. Thank you.
So the biggest challenge is actually it's ongoing. So for example, South Africa cases, they've got a massive issue, the energy crisis issue, because they've got a lack of electricity supply. So they do have a load shedding policy, that they've got limited access to the electricity. So that affects our team to access to the fieldwork side, having like facilitating their activities with the communities because of that crisis, the conflicts, the tension is going high. And sometimes you are not welcome to the communities because they've got already like lots of things going on, and then they've got history about that NGO peoples, the researchers come and study about their communities and they left, so they're quite used to those culture and not directly helping them. So we are more rely on our communities reader that, so we are not bringing our idea to there, but we are trying to listen to them and then really trying to be flexible within our capacity, whether we can deliver what they want rather than this is what you need to do. This is the climate change is happening now and will gonna worse next. But it wasn't quite easy from our research collaborator in South Africa. They are quite registered by listening academic kind of context of climate change at all. So we try to make them think about it by using those activities as well as recording their books. But we've got a big warning from that, it might not gonna work. So that's always the biggest challenge. Even though we are ready to, we are trying to be flexible, there is always a hurdle that you're not going to get what you wanted from the beginning of the research design.
Yeah, I guess you have to be sort of open to the process to see what develops throughout, but also in the outcomes, as we can see, you sort of, there's something that stays with the community. So the books and the whole, all the material that they can to use directly. So it's, as you say, it's different from an approach that maybe other communities are used to, that the researchers just join in, come, do the research and leave. So yeah, it sounds challenging, but it sounds like you are achieving what you set up to do.
We're very thankful to our collaborators because we didn't come up with the clear idea about we were going to make the comic book, we were going to make an active storybook for communicate with the communities, but it's kind of worked well to have this outcome because I guess we listen first, like what is the right channel, right tool to communicate with the listening local neighbors. And I don't know, it's like as a researcher, when you try to get the fund, you have to have like full design of the research, how this will gonna work and how you're gonna apply, what kind of method that you will gonna apply. But from this project, it's just the flexibility and then deliver what the community needs. That was the main key, I guess.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's true integrated and collaborative learning kits, toolkits. It's great. Dr. Chow, I'd like to thank you very much for your presentation today. It was great listening to you and learning a bit more about critical. I think that's it for today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Do we have another question? I'm sorry, it's just that way. Oh, so we do have another question. Natalia, was it a Portuguese question? I'm sorry, I didn't get that one.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Roots of Resilience is at a very similar stage at the moment. We're going into schools and universities, and we have other challenges too, similar challenges, to connect with communities.
and behaviors, and we need to get the proper, obviously, permission to be able to go into schools. So comparing critical with, what are the similarities and the differences that you've noticed in terms of using indigenous knowledge within communities? And since you've already worked in different countries, how would you compare the learning that critical has gathered? And the other thing that I wanted to ask is, how were you received by the communities? And also the products that you offered them, how were they received as well? Because quite often you get researchers who go, they do an intervention, and they leave. There's no exchange. So I'd like to know how the communication worked and how you distributed the knowledge and how they received that knowledge afterwards that you'd gathered. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your question, Natalia. So, yes, we've got a very unique 3 different case study areas in South Africa and Indonesia and Sri Lanka. Now, they do have different focus and different method, different approach to contact, the approach to their local communities. So it was more our partners' work. So they were kind of independently already they had a kind of partnership with their local area, or the connection or relationship already there. For example, South Africa team from the Pretoria University, they already had a connection within the Inland School of Communities. So it was easier then to approach it to the community and then continuing their relationship, bring more resources to the community. But none of us were sure about how this will gonna be worked out beginning of this project. But I guess we were quite lucky to have those partners and delivering different method to each case study. So collecting data, I mean, it was purely qualitative research, gathering qualitative data as a storyline. So it was all same. They talked first. That was our main data collection method, interviewing, doing workshops, and also sharing our outcomes as well. At the moment that what we delivered with the Sri Lanka and Indonesia team, we developed the community toolkit together to keep the conversation going, activities going, so they're aware of it. But it's not directly deliver adaptation method, but adaptation actions. But we are kind of try to initiate by using or applying those community toolkit, using the map and then the books. So they can keep thinking about their history, culture, heritage, and then changes, and then the future, hopefully. So that's the kind of way of sharing. But we're quite not sure. So, for example, Sri Lanka case, we got follow-up that she's been keep connecting with the communities because she's got relatives there, and then connection there, and then they got keep reported by the people. They've been using that book, and then another workshop was going to happen, and then they wanted to expand to another application of this meat-free oil extraction, having another tree seed extraction method. So it can keep growing, but we're not quite sure our next stage how we can support our partners because of funding issues and their local policies. Some areas they're not quite keen, so local level of policymakers or planners or the local authorities, they are not interested. We haven't received any indication they are interested in supporting those communities yet, but we try to reach out a bit more. Thank you. Hopefully this answer to your question.
Acho que a gente não recebeu mais nenhuma questão no chat, correto, Fabi? Bom, acho que hoje é isso. Eu reforço a fala da Fabiana e o que eu disse no início. Nós vamos compartilhar os links que a Dr. Cha trouxe para a gente com os resultados do Critical. É um projeto com vários investigadores, né? Já está no segundo follow-on, né? Na segunda adição de financiamento. Ele vem da mesma raízes de resiliência, então estamos todos há mais ou menos 3 anos já tentando entender essas conexões entre questões climáticas e patrimônio cultural. Então, já tem bastante resultados, já tem os toolkits que ela mencionou, né, esses guias de aplicação metodológica, e a gente vai deixar disponível para todo mundo. Quem quiser ter acesso a algum material específico também, ou tiver alguma dúvida, pode contato conosco da P. Tem o nosso site, então vocês conseguem nossos contatos lá também para isso. E aí eu reforço o convite para a semana que vem. Na terça que vem a gente vai ter a segunda edição, né, desse webinar, e durante todo o mês de maio nós vamos manter essa divisão, essa programação com outros pesquisadores, com outros projetos dessa mesma coorte de financiamento. E nós vamos finalizar no dia 25 de maio, no Rio de Janeiro, com um encontro que vai ser híbrido. Então, a gente vai ter um encontro presencial no Rio de Janeiro no dia 25 de manhã, e que vai ser transmitido também em inglês e português no nosso canal do YouTube, para a própria PPP compartilhar, né, as suas metodologias no nosso projeto Raízes de Resiliência. Então, reforço que terça que vem nós nos encontramos de novo, e nas terças-feiras seguintes, e no final do mês a gente pode se encontrar ou presencialmente no Rio de Janeiro, no Memorial Getúlio Vargas, ou online mais uma vez. É isso, agradeço a presença de todos, quem nos acompanha em português e inglês, e até mais.
Thank you all very much. I'm just going to synthesize what Natalia said, because I think we had a little problem with the translation, but just to thank everyone for being with us today. Reminding that we'll be sharing the links that Dr. Cha presented at the end of her presentation, because we had some requests to have the links of the material. That also will be here again for the next 3 Tuesdays in the same time, presenting different methodologies. And we'll have a final seminar the 25th of May, which will be hybrid. There'll be presential in Brazil, but we'll be transmitting online as well via YouTube, when PPP, People's Palace Project, will be presenting its own methodology for roots of resilience. So thank you all very much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again in the next following 3 Tuesdays and on the 25th of May. Dr. Cha, thank you once again. It was great. It was a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much.